In this session, we're going to talk about three genres: boogie woogie, jump blues, and blues crooners. So this is really the rise of R&B. I think I've mentioned before the idea that the term R&B comes to replace the various other replacements for race music, right? It was known for a while as the Harlem Hit Parade and so on. So the R&B becomes, rhythm and blues becomes the chart designation for black music, just like country and western to become the chart designation for country music, and instead of hillbilly music, right? And then, of course, the pop charts have gone under various names, but we tend to simplify that by just calling them the pop charts. So three different approaches to the aftermath of the blues, so to speak, right? With three different sets of notions of instrumentation, of basic approach to aesthetics and singing and so on. So let's take a look. Boogie Woogie may stretch back to the late 1800s, and it's hard to say. It depends on how you read certain diary entries and letters and so on, and people's memories, of course. But as you probably know, people tend to project things in their memories further back than is actually true. But it certainly came to prominence by the 1920s through the 1940s through pianists playing in honky-tonks and rent parties, and also pianists playing in these lumber mills, or not the mills so much, but the what would happen when people were harvesting lumber, when they would send them out to the forests to chop down trees, they would send them out in a train, right, to get them deep into the forest, and they would have a set of train cars, and one of those train cars would have a piano in it. And what you do is you ship them all out there, and then they live in the train. You just leave the train there while they're working, and then you bring them back after the end of however many weeks or months they're out there. And it was very typical to have these pianos on those kinds of trains at the lumber harvesting sites, and that's part of how Boogie Woogie was performed as well, at least according to some accounts. It relies on, by the way, just in case it's not clear, a rent party was very typical in the early 20th century in cities like New York, where if you were having a little trouble bringing together rent, you buy a small amount of food or whatever and have a party, and everybody pays a small admission fee to get in. And sometimes you would have contests. This is very typical to have cutting contests. This is an important part of stride piano as well, which is somewhat related to boogie woogie. It's somewhere in between boogie woogie and ragtime is stride piano, right? Stride piano is, of course, also a big part of early jazz. And basically, these cutting contests were where you'd have two or three pianists, and they would compete for applause, and they'd get a small cash prize, whoever won. Now, Boogie Woogie relies on several steady left-hand patterns, a heavier, more percussive, somewhat simpler version of stride piano, but with the left hand employing a much more restricted motion. So you're not jumping the wide leaps. Stride piano is called that because of the wide leaps that the left hand jumps. Here it's a little more restricted, and the right hand syncopates against it. So typical left-hand patterns, you have things like doubling the bass, where the left hand alternates between fifths and sixths, the basic doop pattern, right? And then you have the walking bass, and usually this is a dominant plus a sixth. So you go from the root to the third to the fifth, sixth, 7, 6, 5, right? Do 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 kind of thing. So these typical patterns. One of the early figures in recorded Boogie Woogie comes from 1928, and this is Clarence Pinetop Smith, and he released Pinetop's Boogie Woogie on Vocalion Records, and this was an early Boogie Woogie hit, and it's one that you should listen to. You can hear some of those left-hand patterns, and the left hand really becomes important because it's kind of the rhythm section for these solo Boogie Woogie performances, where the idea is that the left hand is playing the kind of percussive rhythm section element here, right? So the highest compliment you could get as a stride pianist or a boogie woogie pianist was to have a left hand like God. That's how several people put it. So this idea of having a super dependable left hand, and then the right hand is much freer in relationship to it. So you're talking about a style of music where you're encouraging relative independence between the two hands. One early moment in which Boogie Woogie kind of comes to the fore is during this concert in 1938. John Hammond, we've seen him over and over again, the A&R man for Columbia, the guy that represented Fletcher Henderson and Benny Goodman and Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday, and later we'll see Bob Dylan and so on, had this very long career and really managed a whole lot of talent. He was very interested, as we saw, in the Kansas City sound, and so he wants to promote really jazz in general, black music in general, but highlighting the Kansas City part of things a bit. So he invites the Kansas City singer Big Joe Turner and the pianist Pete Johnson to his Carnegie Hall concert from Spirituals to Swing, which we've mentioned before. While in New York City, they signed to Vocalion Records, and they recorded Rollin' Pete on December 30th of 1938. And this is one of the earliest recorded examples of a backbeat, right? Of the emphasis on 2 and 4 and that steady backbeat. In 1939, they started residency at the Cafe Society. We talked about that in relation to Billie Holiday and Strange Fruit last time. This is in Greenwich Village, of course. And then Hammond was, by this point, Hammond is one of the owners of that club, and he booked entertainment. So he also booked Albert Ammons, another great boogie woogie pianist, and then Meade Lux Lewis, whose career was largely a result of Hammond's intervention. And then, of course, we mentioned Billie Holiday was very important there. So for a while, you had three of the greatest, mostly Kansas City-based boogie woogie pianists in New York playing regularly at the Cafe Society. And it really comes to shape the sound of the late 30s and early 40s. And it contributes to the rise of the next genre we're going to talk about, which is jump blues. The jump blues is an up-tempo, dance-oriented hybrid of jazz and blues performed by a small group, featuring horns and relying heavily on boogie woogie that was particularly popular in the 1940s, the style, the jump blues. It's considered a precursor to both rhythm and blues in the modern sense and rock and roll, and it prominently features a fairly distinct sax sound, sort of the honking sax sound, derived from the grittier moments in Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster, the two jazz saxophone greats. Jump blues emphasizes a strong rhythm section. In fact, some songs really are mostly rhythm section with a relatively underemphasized horn line or a horn melody that comes in and out. The singing style clearly derives from Big Joe Turner. Big Joe Turner, of course, singing on Rollin' Pete, and as we'll see, he comes to define early rock and roll as well. One of the most important figures that we're going to be talking about this semester, really, is the great black shouter, sometimes called blues shouter, sometimes, just a singer, obviously, Big Joe Turner, an amazing musician and an amazing figure. And a lot of the singing style derives from his approach. So you have this very playful and witty lyrics, the use of jive talk, right? These asides where you're breaking out of the melody to sort of say something funny on the side. So therefore humorous asides. And then the use of lingo, the jive talk in that sense. Jump blues is considered an urban black music, and it had a great deal of crossover appeal, and as we'll see, some record labels even catered toward the jump blues as part of their crossover market, right? So it appealed to both black listeners and white listeners, and it appealed in part to black listeners who no longer nostalgically longed for the South. So it's one of the true modern forms of R&B that doesn't somehow have any real strong connections to the South. For instance, another version of R&B that we'll talk about next time will be Chicago blues. But Chicago blues directly comes out of the South and still has some very close ties to country blues and so on. Jump blues is really meant to have more of an urban northern sound, or at least that's how people think of it at the time. So there's several important early bands. Two of the earliest are probably Lionel Hampton and Lucky Melinder. In 1942, Hampton's band records Flying Home, and that's a tune you should listen to. And it includes a choked tenor sax performance, so this kind of honking sax by Illinois Jacquet, one of the great players of that period. Billboard described it as a jumper that defies standing still, so it was clearly meant to be a dance tune. And there are several important artists within the jump blues style. There's Louis Jordan, there's Big Joe Turner, Charles Brown, T-Bone Walker, and Wynonie Harris. We already talked about Lionel Hampton before, of course. He was the vibraphone player. He had been playing with in the integrated small band with Benny Goodman, and now he's making a solo career with his own band, which is, like I said, it's not really a big band exactly. It's a smaller scale version of that, so a jump blues band. And that song in particular was a huge hit for him, and spawned several cover versions and so on. T-Bone Walker is another figure that's very successful within the jump blues style, a very influential guitarist. He influenced people like Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry. And he had a huge hit with the 1947 song Stormy Monday, and that would be a good one to check out. His approach to the guitar, as you'll hear, anticipates Chuck Berry in some ways, where while often there is a clear distinction between solo guitar work and rhythmic guitar work, there are times where he blurs those lines a little bit. Not as much as we'll see later, but there are times where he blurs those lines. The big character, though, the most important character, the most charismatic character in the jump blues sound is Louis Jordan. He's called the king of the jukebox because of his crossover success. Jukeboxes are as we saw recently, they're becoming a thing now, right? In the 30s and 40s, where you can put in a quarter and listen to whatever song you want, and he really rules the jukebox scene in a large sense. He's ranked. His band is ranked the fifth most successful, and so he is the fifth most successful recording artist according to Billboard. And he had at least 4 million selling hits, right? So 4 hits that sold over 1 million. Now keep in mind the records from this time are unclear, so that means he probably had more than 4, and the ones that we know that sold at least 1 million probably sold a lot more than 1 million. But he was a very successful musician. Another part of his success is that he's incredibly charismatic. He's got this winning smile, and when you see him in the film that I like you to look at, this short film for this week, you'll see that he's got this this charisma about him. He draws you in. There's something very down home in one sense about what he's doing and sophisticated in another. It's a hard line to navigate, a hard line to walk or whatever. And he's a very impressive performer in a number of ways, both as a screen presence, a film presence, and then, of course, as a musician. So he was featured in several of these soundies, what are called soundies. And they're almost like a jukebox for small music videos. And sometimes you could play them through a small machine where you put in a quarter and you can play the little video just like you would a jukebox. And then sometimes they would show these films as musical shorts before a feature film in theaters. So they're not unlike music videos. And he was the star of several of them. He started his career as a saxophonist for the Chick Webb Band. That's the same band from which Ella Fitzgerald came, right? She was the singer with the Chick Webb Band, and they were one of the major swing bands, black swing bands of that period. They pretty much owned the Savoy for a while. And he was playing with that band in 1936, and they were famous. That band was famous for their cutting contests, right? They had several contests with Benny Goodman and with various other bands, Duke Ellington and so on, where they would usually win. They would show themselves to be at least the more popular band on that evening. And he was a part of that band, which is perhaps surprising because that's a very virtuosic band, and you don't necessarily think of Louis Jordan as a virtuosic player, but he really was. He founded the Timpani Five in 1938, and that's his own band, and it's a jump blues band, so it's a scaled-back band. They first recorded for Decca Records on December 20th of 1938. In fact, they were on the Sepia series in Decca, and Decca basically created the Sepia series for Louis Jordan. In 1941, they launched the Sepia series, and this is where you would pay 35 cents for a record, so it was relatively inexpensive, featuring black artists with crossover potential. So they were selling them at a slightly lower cost than most of their records, in hopes that they could sell large volumes and that it would appeal. They were looking for bands that would appeal to both black and white audiences. So they're trying to find the widest appeal possible. And Jordan really, he rules that, right? So he transfers from the Race series to the Sepia series. Nat King Cole is also on this series, and he, even more than Nat King Cole, Louis Jordan really rules that series. His albums are huge successes with both white and black audiences. In July of 1942, he begins stockpiling, or rather Decca begins stockpiling his recordings. They know the AFM ban is coming, and so instead of releasing everything at once, this was a smart move on the part of Decca. Not too many other recording companies followed this, but it's a smart move. What they did is they saw the ban was coming. They knew that it was being considered. So what they did is they had these marathon sessions with Louis Jordan where he's just recording song after song, and he was very good at coming up with, most of them are 12 bar blues songs, so, or some variation on that. So they're not terribly complicated as far as the harmony is concerned. A lot of them follow the same basic harmonies, not all of them, but it's his arrangements and his melodic lines and really the cleverness of his lyrics. That's what's impressive about Louis Jordan. And then, of course, his delivery. But basically, they stockpile these recordings so they can release them slowly. So his career really does quite well during this period because he doesn't disappear from the scene like so many other people do, even though he's not allowed to record because he is part of the musicians union. His first number one is the song "What's the Use of Getting Sober When I'll Only Get Drunk Again," right? And that's from this marathon session. Here we have some movie posters and at the bottom, toward the middle there, you see a screenshot, a still from one of his small films, or some of these are soundies, some of them are just shorter films, like lengthy enough to be considered feature films, but only, about an hour or whatever. And you can see Louis Jordan there with his thumb up and that big smile. There's something very charismatic about him. On the one above that, the Reet Petite and Gone. Reet Petite is a song that he performs, so it's being worked into the title, and you can see that this one has both of these have a little more than a plot going, so they're not soundies, they're slightly longer films, but he also performed in many soundies, which were just basically music videos. One of the keys to his success is Milt Gabler. We've mentioned Milt Gabler before. He is the one that recorded on Commodore Records. He recorded Strange Fruit when Columbia Records refused to record it for Billie Holiday, right? They thought it would be too controversial. And so he's very involved in both the jazz worlds and the jump blues world. Many of Jordan's recordings were produced by Milt Gabler, even though Jordan is on Decca Records. Milt Gabler doesn't work only for Commodore Records. He moves around quite a bit. So many of his recordings, Jordan's recordings, are produced by Milt Gabler, who was also involved in the development of early rock and roll. He was the producer of Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. So Milt Gabler is going to show up for us quite a bit. He's a very important producer. He has, I would say, a very good ear for how to make a recording, and this is something that he collaborates, obviously, with Louis Jordan. Louis Jordan is in the driver's seat for a lot of this, but Milt Gabler learns from Louis Jordan that these recordings really can be a little narrative piece. They really can be this sort of imaginary cinema. And Louis Jordan is brilliant at this. Listen to, for instance, Saturday Night Fish Fry. That's a classic example where he tells this whole story close your eyes and try to picture what he's telling you and listen to how these characters come to life and the interaction with the police and the people shouting out and sometimes it's women and sometimes it's men and so on, and he acts the whole thing out in song, right? Some of these really brilliant tunes. And then you have some other songs that aren't as narrative, like Let the Good Times Roll. And it too it's not narrative in the sense of telling a story from beginning to end, but it's this perfect little vignette. It's this perfect little environment that's created in its 3 minutes, and then it's over, right? And so Jordan has this string of really important hits. Saturday Night Fish Fry, that one's sometimes thought of as the first rock and roll record. You have Caledonia, which was a huge hit for him. He recorded it several times. It's in several of his soundies. Some of the soundies are just simply about Caledonia, and she's acted out by various actresses. She's this woman with these exaggerated features. It's obviously a comedy song, and it features him going into a sort of falsetto scream with Caledonia, and you'll hear if you hear it, it's a very engaging tune. Choo Choo Boogie, that's a big hit for him as well. Obviously, working out that train symbolism that is so prevalent in blues in general. And then, of course, one of my favorites is Let the Good Times Roll. A very moody, very, I think, touching song. And yet you can see how it would still be very popular and accessible and so on. Then we have the Blues Crooners. The most important early one is probably Leroy Carr. This is the cooler end of R&B, right? Crooning in general, this idea of being close to the microphone and speaking softly or singing softly. So it relates back to the late 20s and 30s, especially the recordings of pianist Leroy Carr and his guitarist, colleague, Scrapper Blackwell. Their work was very sophisticated and smooth, in sharp contrast to the contemporaneous recordings of Charlie Patton or Blind Lemon Jefferson. And in the late 1930s, of course, Nat King Cole appears, and he takes on this blues crooner kind of personality. Leroy Carr, of course, sang the How Long blues. That, to me, is the beginning of this tradition, right? And Nat King Cole follows it up in his trio. And then we have a series of these blues crooners that we can talk about. For instance, Cecil Gant, who's one of my favorites. You don't hear about him as much anymore. I think he's woefully neglected. But he had a number one on the Harlem Hit Parade, which basically was the R&B chart at that time, with I Wonder, which is this amazing song. Some people don't like his voice, but it's this very clear, very striking voice. It's not a gritty voice. It's not a bluesy voice in that sense. He's singing these blues songs, but in this very sort of... I don't want to say popish exactly voice. There's something very compelling about it, and it's engaging. It's a little nasally. It's a really interesting voice. So he's a pianist and singer. He got his start during World War II, and so he's sometimes known as the GI sensation, right? Because he was a GI. And I Wonder is his big hit. This was for the independent label Gilt Edge. He had a few other minor hits after that, but that was really the only one it was the only one that made number one on any chart, and it was the only one that really got into the national consciousness. The next person we'll talk about was a much bigger success as far as blues crooning is concerned. And that's Charles Brown. Charles Brown, obviously also a pianist and singer. He had 10 top 10 hits on the independent record label Aladdin, which is a very important label for early R&B. A lot of the early R&B we'll be discussing appears on Aladdin Records. He played light classical music as well as a very sophisticated poppy approach to blues, and his voice is very different from Cecil Gant's, but it's also very accessible. He had a hit in 1951 with Black Knight, which was the number one on the R&B charts. So you can see we're already switching from Harlem Hit Parade to the R&B charts right around this time. And it was up there at number one for 14 weeks, which is a very important accomplishment. It's a 12-bar blues, but at a very slow tempo. And it's it's a very moody piece. And you can imagine why it would have been successful. And it's in this period, the late 40s, early 50s, there's this very important transitional period where singers are coming more to the fore, and there are more genres sort of at hand, right? We have jump blues. Just today we talked about 3 genres, and that's not just that's not all we have just even with blues. When blues started, you basically had country blues and city blues, and then that was it, right? Now we have this more and more of a splitting off of all these genres. So the late 40s and the early 50s are a very important moment for the development of popular music in this country, and this is part of why. So that's it for this one, a relatively short one, and I will see you next time.